Is that sound good? Can everybody hear? Excellent, great. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. So we have an hour. I think I'm going to be about 45 minutes to leave some time for some questions and comments and discussion. So the story of Winnie and Nelson can be told at so many levels. And the last level I want to get to is us today, and just quite how alive they and their relationship and their disputes still remain in the context of a government of national unity. But that is at the end. I want to start by telling this story perhaps in the most familiar way that it can be told, a story that we all know very well. It begins in January 1957 in Johannesburg, where a 38-year-old lawyer is driving in his car from Soweto to the center of Johannesburg. He is 6'2", broad-shouldered, very athletic and strong. He's a very flashy man. He drives a fancy green Oldsmobile. He gets his suits tailored at the most expensive tailor in Johannesburg. He is also married with 3 children, but his marriage is in trouble. He is notoriously known as a womanizer and a philanderer. And he is driving on his routes into Johannesburg, and he drives past a bus stop and sees an absolutely gorgeous young woman, about half his age, 19, 20 years old. So beautiful that he thinks of stopping his car and turning around. But instead, what he does, being the sort of man he is he finds out who she is, finds her phone number, phones her, invites her to lunch. And a little over a year later, he is divorced, and the two of them are married. This is a very familiar tale from the mid-century. A powerful, much older man, seduced by the beauty of a woman barely out of her teens. A young, naive woman overwhelmed by the power of an older man. It's a very stereotypical, decades before Me Too, mid-20th century story. It could have come out of Mad Men. And that is what happened between them, and that is one level of the story. But there's something about the two of them which twists the story into something else, something much grander. And that's that both of these people are from the very elite of their world, are born to lead, and are hungry for very ambitious and hungry for a role in public life, hungry for power. Nelson Mandela grew up in the home of the paramount chief of the Tembu. He was educated in the most elite, prestigious schools that a young Black man of his time could possibly go to. First Helltown for high school, then Fort Hare University. This put him at the very, very pinnacle of the elite. These were institutions which, if you attended and passed from, meant that you were going to lead your people in one form or another. Went to Johannesburg and became a lawyer, and was one of 65 Black attorneys in Johannesburg when he met Winnie Madikizela. The very cream of the elite, and also a rising activist. In fact, had been tapped as a potential leader the moment he got to Johannesburg, and had recently been the volunteer-in-chief of the Defiance campaign a couple of years earlier, was on trial for treason. He was a big person, a very, very ambitious political person, as was the young woman he met on the side of the road. Winnie Madikizela was no less an elite person than Nelson Mandela was. Her father was also royalty in Pondoland. She also went to the finest missionary schools available to young Black women at the time. Her father had sent her to tertiary education. She had just trained as a social worker. For a young Black woman in the 1950s, that placed her in the top 0.1% of young Black women at the time. She was also somebody who was looking for a place in public life, looking for a place to lead and to exercise power. And when these two people came together, they were very flashy, they were very modern, they looked very beautiful together, and they very soon attracted the attention of the Black press, of cameras. The engagement was a big deal. It was all over the newspapers. They were written about. And they both understood something which I think placed them well ahead of their time. They understood that what they looked like together was powerful, but not just in a superficial celebrity way, but in a political way. They understood that a beautiful, modern, stylish Black couple photographed together, their image mass reproduced, was a very, very powerful political statement in apartheid South Africa. So intuitively, maybe even subconsciously, from the very beginning, they understood that their marriage was not just an electric sexual affair between two people, but was a political asset, was something that could be presented to the world and used politically. Their marriage itself, it had a doubleness from the beginning. It was a private affair between two people, but they both understood it as a very, very potent political tool. And that really is the beginning of the story, this double marriage between two human beings, but also between two people who wanted their union to be a myth, who wanted their union to be a political instrument. That is at the heart of their story. They were married in 1958. Within 2 years, the Sharpeville massacre happened. The ANC and the PAC were banned. Nelson Mandela went underground. By then, he had one young daughter with Winnie, and another one was soon on the way. And shortly after the banning of the ANC, he and other comrades took a very controversial decision to turn to armed struggle, and he became the leader of that armed struggle, the leader of the newly formed Umkhonto weSizwe, and used his capacity to perform as a new underground leader very, very powerfully. He dropped the persona of the slick lawyer. He dropped the very fancy bespoke threads, began wearing big trench coats, lost his parting and grew his hair and grew a beard, and began looking and performing a guerrilla, a black man who was prepared to return to violence, and played a very dramatic persona, a very dramatic theatrical role. He was underground. He developed a relationship with specific journalists and called them from phone boxes in the middle of the night, and they would narrate the story of the man who became known as the Black Pimpernel. And in that period, when he was on the run, when he was underground, he became, in that moment, the most famous black man in the country, somebody who was spoken about at dinner tables night after night, as a mysterious underground black man prepared to exercise violence and preparing for violence. And as attention turned to him as this mystical figure, so attention turns to the beautiful wife that he had left at home, and the two young daughters. And journalists came to see them. They were curious about them. They took pictures of them. They wanted to know who the beautiful woman was who'd been left at home by the Black Pimpernel. The public narrative about them was soaring. It was going all over the place. It was very exciting and electric. He was then caught, went to prison. The very famous Rivonia trial happened. He spun his persona once again from the guerrilla to the martyr, to the person who was prepared to die. There was a long period where it thought that he would die, where he'd be hanged with his comrades. He wasn't. He was sentenced to life in prison. And the moment he was sentenced to life in prison, Winnie became a huge story again. You know, the beautiful couple was torn asunder indefinitely. Here was the beautiful young mother. Who was she? How was she going to live the rest of her life? It was a magazine story that kept going on and on. And that moment, where it would be clear that they'd be parted indefinitely, was the beginning of a myth which would last until the end of apartheid. And it's a powerful myth really for its simplicity. And it really goes like this, that this very desirable couple, this very attractive couple that you want to see pictures of, have been torn asunder. And we don't know when they're going to see one another again. But what we do know is that the day that they see each other again is the day that their people are free. That the two stories are now completely entwined. The story of this couple and their separation, and the story of Black South Africa and its freedom become one story. And this is something that I think they'd been moving to from the day they got married. The idea that their marriage, the story of the two of them, could embody something not just big, but embody everything, could embody the entire story of their country's struggle for freedom. And the story I've just told you didn't emerge organically. It was constructed, it was worked on. It was a political project that many people were involved in making to take this marriage and elevate it and use it as the most powerful symbol that it could become. And it's a long story, and we only have 45 minutes, but let me tell you a couple of the key moments. One key moment was 1978, when Nelson Mandela had been in prison 16 years, and the key figure, the president of the ANC, exiled in London, Oliver Tambo, who had once been the law partner of Nelson Mandela, took a decision, and I think a very fateful decision, not consulting with any of his comrades on the ANC executive, to have an international campaign to celebrate Nelson Mandela's 60th birthday. He was turning 60 in July 1978. And it was an interesting decision because it went against ANC culture and ANC tradition. It was about a cult of an individual. It was about taking one man and saying that he symbolizes our struggle, which was very much not in the ANC's tradition. And it turned out to be an astonishingly successful campaign. It was organized through the Anti-Apartheid Committee at the UN. And in dozens and dozens of countries around the world, simple cards with Nelson Mandela's picture went out to thousands of people, and they were simply asked to sign it and to wish him happy birthday. And by the 17th of July 1978, first tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of birthday cards appeared in Robben Island to wish Nelson Mandela a happy 60th birthday. At first, the prison authorities kept them piled up and eventually didn't know what to do with them and burnt them all. But here was a global figure in the making. And as he became a global figure, so of course did his wife. And the story went on about this couple that were torn apart and must be reunited when their people are free. And it got bigger and bigger in the 1980s. By the early 80s, it had really penetrated and seeped into pop culture. Concerts were held in his honor. People began writing songs about him that got to the top of the charts in the United Kingdom and the US. It was a story of a marriage which became a ubiquitous universal story in popular culture in the West in the 1980s. Extraordinarily successful. I mean, why did Oliver Tambo take a decision to do something like that? For a number of reasons. I mean, partly it was the politics of the Cold War was strangling the ANC. It was receiving money and arms from the Soviet Union, which made its work very difficult in the West. I think Tambo very creatively and intuitively understood that a simple story about a man and a woman torn apart transcended post-war politics. There was a simplicity and an emptiness to it that was very attractive. It could transcend ideology. I mean, another is that the ANC was losing ground inside South Africa. The 1976 uprisings was not associated with the ANC. It was associated with anybody with a Black consciousness movement. In 1977, Steve Biko was killed and he became the main symbol of the struggle. He was not ANC. So in a sense, Nelson Mandela's great friend, Oliver Tambo, used his friend and mythologized his friend in order to gain traction, really as a weapon, as a tactic to bring the ANC back to the center of things. So that's very, in broad brushstrokes, the public story of this marriage. This marriage as a myth, this marriage as a symbol and a vessel for liberation of a people. And probably South Africa's most successful export in its history, more successful than its creators and the two components themselves, Nelson and Winnie Mandela, could ever have imagined. But obviously, while this myth is being thrown into the world and is catching fire in the world and is so successful, you actually have two living flesh and blood human beings who have to carry that myth. And so what I want to turn to now is what was happening to these two people as their myth was expanding and going out into the world, the actual Winnie and Nelson Mandela, the two real human partners in this marriage. So when Nelson Mandela went to prison, the apartheid state went after Winnie with the most extraordinary persistence and energy in a real campaign to destroy her. They first banned her and restricted her movement so that she could no longer do her job as a social worker and left her unemployed and without income. They then stopped her children from going to school. One after another, they would visit the principal and tell the principal that these two young girls do not belong there. Eventually, they had to be educated in Swaziland. A real concerted campaign to make her life unlivable. In the mid-1960s, she very bravely tried to form an underground network of ANC activists in Soweto. The apartheid state was well aware of this and planted spies in her network, including a woman called Maud Katzenellenberg, who came very close to Winnie and gave her resources, money, and work, but was reporting back to the security forces every day, every week. And eventually in 1969, Winnie was arrested along with 21 others and put on trial for treason. She was in prison for 17 months. It's hard to exaggerate what a formative time it was for her. For one reason, that she was kept in solitary confinement for 17 months, which is an extraordinary torture for anybody to endure. And we know something of what she went through because for a couple of months during that time, she kept a secret diary. And it really is a diary of somebody who is losing their sanity. It's somebody who is toying with killing herself, playing with herself, really gaining strength from the fact that she could end it all by killing herself at any moment and getting courage from that. It's really, I don't know if any of you have read it, but it's extreme. It is somebody really at the edge. Another reason why those 17 months were formative is her humiliation. She got very ill in the early stages of her incarceration, and her enemy, the security police, planted a lawyer who helped her get medical attention, but was working for them, and completely seduced her. She thought that this man was on her side and tried to get her co-defendants to drop their lawyer and get him. So her head was played with, and she was deeply humiliated by that. But at least in her memory, the most important or the most vivid moment of those 17 months was her 5 days of interrogation at the hands of a man called Jonny. She was never physically touched by him during those 5 days, but she was made to stay awake for 5 days in a row, which is itself a very extreme form of torture. And he would speak to her constantly. Well, he'd be in and out of the room, there'd be other people. But the way she'd remember it was that she'd seldom been as intimately close to another person. He was talking to her as intimately as he could, and trying to drain her, trying to destroy her, talking to her about her death, about what would happen to her corpse, about the fact that her husband probably wouldn't miss her. Sort of a tirade of psychological attack, which she'd remember a long time. She was released in 1970. She played quite an important role in the Soweto uprisings in 1976. Was banished to a small town in the Free State called Brandfort, where she was only allowed to meet with one person at a time, very isolated there. And in 1985, so this is now 15 years after her incarceration, she was giving an interview with a Canadian journalist. And in the middle of this interview, suddenly Jonny appears. This was the man who interrogated her 15 years earlier, and was very clear that he'd been in her head all the time. And what she said about Swanepoel was very disturbing. She said that he made me. I am, in a sense, his child. He has made me what I am. Because I was so close to him that I imbibed his hatred for me. I really felt his will to destroy me. And I imbibed it and threw it back at him. I wanted to kill him. I wanted to destroy him. And the fight between us is a struggle to the death. Only one of us can survive. And then she does a very disturbing thing. She leaps, without entirely realizing it, from talking about her and Swanepoel to her entire country. And she says, for that reason, apartheid cannot end peacefully. Just as the struggle between me and Swanepoel is a struggle to the death, so is the struggle against apartheid. It has to be a struggle of mass violence, and it has to end in the extinction of one side or the other. It is that sort of struggle. Quite a disturbing thing for her to say. At this very time, in 1985, the country is broken out into insurrection. She defies her banning order and goes home to Soweto and begins organizing a gang of young men under her care and in her house, and arms them. And her purpose is, it's renegade, but it's deeply political. It is about violent revolution. It's about arming people to fight. So that's one side of the story, or at least a sliver of one side of the story of what's happening to one of these two human beings, while the international myth of their marriage is going all over the world. I mean, what's happening to Nelson Mandela during this time in prison? I mean, what Winnie went through is one form of torture, but 27 years behind bars of being separated from your life is another form of torture. I mean, nobody ever kept Nelson Mandela awake for 5 days and 5 nights. Nobody laid a hand on him. He was well fed. But those 27 years of isolation were as brutal, but in other ways. And one of the things that began happening to Nelson Mandela, and you can see this through the letters that he's writing over the years, is that his very sense of self, his sense of being, his sense of identity becomes increasingly wrapped up in his relationship with her, with Winnie. But in a very strange and disturbing sense, in a prisoner sense, he doesn't know who she is anymore. They see each other a couple of times a year in the most straitened, restricted circumstances, being watched by armed guards. The Winnie that he's becoming increasingly attached to is an idealized version of the young woman, of the teen, the late teen that he met in the late 1950s. And you see in his letters to her that he's trying to relive their courtship over and over again. And in each letter, it becomes more exciting and more daring and more out there. And in a way, he's trying to keep her interested. He understands that she is moving on. She's becoming an older woman. And he needs to keep her excited. And the courtship becomes this almost religious spectacle in his mind. It's something that needs to be invoked over and over again. But a part of him also understands that that's a fantasy and she's growing older. And sometimes you see in his letters the arc of time losing its direction and becoming scrambled. And in one letter, she'll be the beautiful young woman he was courting in the late 1950s and a woman growing older at the same time. There's a real sense in his writing to her that the time has been scrambled, that he's not quite sure who this woman is. Is she 19? Is she 40? Where does she fit into the arc of life? Very, very moving reading those letters. A second thing happening to him at that time is that he's watching his children's lives fall apart. Most of his children. So his oldest son, Tembi, was killed in a car accident at the age of 24. He had been estranged from Nelson and had not seen him since he'd been to prison. His second son, Mekhato, had really gone off the rails and had become an alcoholic and couldn't hold down a job. His daughter, Makaziwe, was alienated from him, wouldn't speak to him. He was very worried about the two children he'd had with Winnie, especially the younger one, Zinzi, who was not staying in school, not getting educated. And what he thought he saw was the unraveling of the Mandela family and believed it to be entirely his fault. And believed that one of his quests in life would be kind of a desperate existential struggle to keep this family together and to undo the harm that he'd done to his family, to undo the harm by trying to save his children. And as his power grew, as he eventually became one of the most famous, if not the most famous person in the world in the 80s, still in jail, he began trying to use his influence to save his children in very strange ways of getting funding to get Zinzi into university, all sorts of things. He would try to orchestrate their lives from his place in prison. And a third thing that was happening to him at the time was political, that he was watching his country from the outs, from prison, from a remove, and increasingly began to believe that if there was a civil war in his country, it would be a war from which his country would never recover. That there'd be nothing left to build a new society from. There would be nothing left to build a democracy from. And his great political quest, really from the 1960s, was to ensure that there was going to be a negotiated settlement, was to ensure that the transition from apartheid to democracy was nonviolence. Because if it wasn't nonviolence, he believed it wouldn't take place at all. And so you have a myth of a marriage, and very powerful, very successful myth going all over the world. But the actual concrete human beings inside this marriage are not just drifting apart politically, they've become polar opposites politically. One of them believes that apartheid must end violently or it won't end at all. The other believes that it must end peacefully or there'll be nothing left. And they don't really have an opportunity to discuss this massive political difference between them because all their communication is monitored there. Each is not quite sure who the other is yet politically. And by the time Nelson Mandela is released from prison in 1990, Winnie is in a great deal of trouble. I won't go into all the details of the late 1980s. I think that you probably know them pretty well, and we need time for questions too. But she, Stompie Sapai, the young 14-year-old boy, has been killed on her residence. There have been deaths associated with her gang all over Soweto. She is put on trial for kidnapping. She's in deep trouble. Nelson Mandela, in his first couple of years out of prison, there's this strange paradox about him. He's an enormously famous person. He's politically an enormously powerful person. but personally, he is somebody who is at sea. And he believes that his main quest in life is to get his family back together and to save them, and that they're all falling apart because of him. And he begins to use his political power, or to abuse his political power, to try and save his family. And one of the things he does is he meddles in the kidnapping trial of Winnie. And on the eve of the trial, two of Winnie's co-accused disappear, and they've been ferreted across the border and into ANC camps. Real attempts to scupper the trial. Other things happen. He unilaterally forms a new branch of the ANC so she can lead. He's really motoring. He's using his political power to try and save his wife. And this really happens in the first 2 years of after his release. It's a very horrible, volatile time for both of them. It takes them those 2 years to discover that this relationship that has meant everything to them and that politically is so valuable to them is really hollowed out. And by 1992, Mandela has really stopped trying to intervene, stopped abusing his power to try and save his wife and his marriage. They're estranged, they're divorced. He plays a pivotal, unsubstitutable role in a peaceful transition to democracy. And an extraordinary transition, really, because peaceful, but many people died. About 30,000 people died in those 4 years. But a genuine transition to a genuine majoritarian democracy, which was peaceful, which I think in the late 1980s, very few people thought was possible. And politically, he had triumphed, and Winnie's idea of what a transition should be had failed, had been defeated. And she went down politically. Her star waned. It seemed terminably. And the big moments, I mean, there were many moments along the way, but the big moment of her waning star was a special Truth and Reconciliation Commission inquiry into her and her football club in Soweto and what happened. And the details were gruesome, and she was humiliated. She became a symbol of the dark side of the struggle, a symbol of the bad things that happened during the struggle for liberation. And it seemed that she was over. He remarried. She was pretty much in the wilderness for a long time. But it turns out that the story wasn't over. She really was an extraordinary person. She was I mean, in many ways, they were both, in a sense, genius people at using symbols, at using representation, of understanding how to project themselves into the world and how to project their marriage into the world. And by the time Nelson was a very old man and dying, Winnie, watching the world around her, understood that the country was growing more and more disenchanted, more and more jaded with the country that the ANC and her husband had built. South Africa remained one of the most unequal countries in the world. Race was still very much the center of the country's inequalities. The ANC was becoming more visibly and more depressingly corrupt. And she began retelling the story of their marriage in a way that she knew would resonate deeply with young, largely middle-class urban Black people. And essentially, she said that in those 27 years that Nelson Mandela was in prison, he was cut off from the experience of being Black, the experience of being a Black South African. He was treated well in prison. He was removed. He was out of touch. Whereas she herself was the embodiment of Black experience. She brought the brunt of the pain and the violence. And the language she used to describe this was very, very physical. She said, I was in physical proximity with the enemy. It was my blood they drew. This was a fight to the death, and I was in that fight. I knew that fight. He did not. And she retold the story of this marriage as somebody who'd lost it, somebody who was this, in essence, in spirit, no longer a Black South African, where the other side of the marriage was the embodiment of Black South Africa. And she said that transition to democracy in the early 90s was not a proper transition. And that is because it was negotiated by my husband, who didn't know what it was to be Black anymore. I was marginalized because I was the revolutionary. If I had been the one in charge, we would have fought on, and we eventually would have got a deeper and more radical democracy. Which is quite extraordinary in the context of a myth of a marriage which had been born 50, 60 years earlier. She was still using that marriage. It still had all of its power. but she had really twisted what it had meant to tell a new story. And such a resonant story now, today in 2025. You know, in the election last year, 81% of white people voted for the DA, 4% of Black people voted for the DA, about 45% of colored people. Voting behavior was racially almost as stark as it had been 30 years earlier at the beginning of democracy. Of Black people who voted, 90% either voted for the ANC or for its spin-offs, MK or the EFF, almost none of them for the DA. And so you had this extraordinarily racially divided electorate 30 years into democracy. And the great decision that the ANC was taking about whether to form a coalition with the DA once it had dropped to 40% was, in a strange, airy way, an echo of the dispute between Nelson and Winnie Mandela inside their marriage, where the populists who were not going into this alliance said, you were selling out once again, as you did in the early 1990s. And the other side, Cyril Ramaphosa, directly invoking Nelson Mandela and saying that I am doing what he did, that we can only build this country through unity as he understood. So quite strange that this marriage, which has been such a pregnant vehicle of so much, still in a strange way has this very strong afterlife, is still a vehicle as resonant now in a way as it always was, which in a way is depressing. You would have hoped that 30 years after democracy, the matters that divided them will have dissolved, that the country itself would have changed enough for it to be something of a relic, something we look back to, something in the past. Quite discomforting and quite strange how alive the central dispute between them still remains today. I think that's it for the moment. Really like to hear from you, and any questions, any comments. We still have quite a long time. Yes, I think somebody's going to bring you a microphone.
Thank you for your book, and thank you for coming here to talk to all of us. So my question is, after writing this book here, how have your personal perceptions and feelings about Winnie and Nelson Mandela changed or not?
How have they changed since I wrote the book?
Yeah.
Well, the book was published recently, so I mean, time has to go on. So you know, it's a book written in this moment. Do you mean because of the book? So you can't elaborate. You don't know. No, I mean, I would. I'm not even sure if I aspire to write a book which would change the world. But no, I think you know, the book ends in the present, and basically how I've just ended this talk, with quite how live the dispute remains between them, and it does. I mean, in strange ways, they both, in a way, remain the symbols of the dual sides, of the two sides that raged in debates inside the ANC after the election in a decision about who to go into coalition with. It was an eerily direct echo of the dispute that divided them all those years ago. It was essentially, what is one's relation to the white minority? Does one work with it, or does one fight it? Amazing that 30 years later, you know, in the corridors of the ANC, in activist circles, that remained the dispute. And those two people remained the symbols of each side of the dispute. Winnie and Nelson, they were still the two predominant figures representing the two sides of the dispute, both now dead for quite a long time. So the political legacy of that marriage is unbelievably powerful. The form that dispute took between them, the way in which that marriage was torn asunder, is just powerfully and a little upsettingly contemporary. So what I said about his time in prison is that 27 years cut off from your life was a form of torture. He was never physically abused. He was never kept awake and interrogated for 5 days and nights. He was decently fed. But the 27 years was torture. The 27 years was hell. And yeah. So the conditions changed a great deal over the 27 years. The first few years in the early 1960s were physically brutal. They were about hard physical work all day, every day. They were about from 8 o'clock in the evening until 4 o'clock in the morning, being locked up in a cell without a bed, where the lights were on, overhead lights all night. So yes, absolutely, in the 1960s, that was terrible. As time went on, conditions got much better. And by the 1980s, within the incredibly constrained and strictured and limited forms of being inside a prison, he had much more basic control over his daily life, from being free to read what he could do and to build the garden that he could, and to, in the last 10 years, basically see any visitor that he wanted to see. And so, yes, if I spoke about the 27 years uniformly as one thing, it changed a great deal over the years. But quite importantly, that is the way Winnie, in her last years, spoke about his time in prison. I think very, very unjustly. She very directly, very brutally contrasted their respective experiences. And she said, next to my experience, his was gentle in comparison. I was the one who experienced the violence. I was the one who was tortured. And it's quite upsetting that she did that, because what he went through was very different to what she went through. It wasn't as acute. It wasn't as directly violent, but it was no less a form of torture. I mean, to try and maintain a sense as a human being, as a father, as a husband, and as a leader of your people during those 27 years of separation was nightmarish for him. There's a letter he wrote in 1976 to a comrade, which is particularly moving and upsetting, where he's talking about writing to people and not getting replies from them, and saying, do they understand what it means to me not to get a reply? Do they understand what silence means to me? He said, all I have to imagine my life as it was before, and as it's going to be sometime in the future, is the letters that have been sent to me. And he counted them. I think it was 190 something. I mean, he knew exactly how many. And a roadmap, a map of South Africa that he paused through and traces the routes that he once drove himself. And so you get a sense of somebody who is holding on to thinner and thinner fragments of what a human life can be through these many long years in prison. And so that's chiefly what I meant, is that the duration of the years, the duration of being cut off from a properly human life for 27 years was a greater form of torture for him than anything that physically happened to him inside prison.
Thank you so much for that. What was evoked for me listening to you tell the story was another level of hearing it, which is, I guess, the internalized way in which we carry these different, sort of the internal Winnie and the internal Nelson. And I'm not surprised that it continues to play out, because I feel them like continue to live inside me. Oppressive dynamics, don't disappear when you take away the sort of legislative aspects of them. They continue, it continues in this room, right, which is hardly diverse. And so, when one encounters everyday racism and other forms of oppression, not just racism, one does become enraged, and understand how that rage might want various forms of violent outlet, whether it's verbal, whether it's, think of that beautiful scene last year with that young Maori woman in New Zealand Parliament and the haka that she did, right?
Yeah.
Such a like visceral expression of that feeling of oppression. And then one wants to find strategic, less reactive like ways to be in the world, to build relationship, to build a future, to build a different kind of world. So yeah, I think it's a very relatable tension. There's something almost be interesting about, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this, but interesting, if you take the archetypal feminine and the archetypal masculine, interesting that she embodies the radical, the violence, the active, he embodies the other, I would love to hear your perspective on that.
So I think that if you had told everybody in 1994 what was going to happen over the next 30 years, if you had said that from around 2011 or so, the economy would stop growing and remain stagnant and at times decline for the next 14 years, that life would stop getting better for most people, that you'd have a spectacular unemployment rate in 2025. I think 9 out of 10 people, and you said, well, what happens to a country in that situation? I think 9 out of 10 people would have said to you it would have exploded by now. That a young democracy can't survive such circumstances. So in a way, the fact that there's the dispute in this marriage remains so alive, for me, given what's happened in this country over the last while, is in a sense quite hopeful. The sense that the dispute remains about how closely South Africans can work with one another is a reflection of resilience, a reflection of moderation, a great fear of what might happen without moderation, of how bad things could get. So in a way, yes, it's very troubling to me that a dispute of 30 years ago remains a dispute of today. But given what's happened over the last 30 years, it isn't surprising. I mean, on her being the violent woman and him the peaceful man, I think part of the reason why she still means so much to so many young people is this really explosive combination of things. And the one is an absolute refusal to compromise, an insistence that violence is right. But saying that as a woman, as a mother, as somebody who began saying it in middle-aged, it's an incredibly powerful combination. It's a powerful combination in a country where more and more households are run by women, where marriage is a declining institution. That cocktail of what WINNIE is, a woman who never remarried after her divorce from Nelson. I mean, all of that is funneled into a very powerful set of meanings. So I think the fact, not just she is a woman, but the sort of woman she is, who unapologetically advocated violence, is part of her allure, part of what makes her very powerful as a symbol. Yes.
Thanks, Jonny. This has been really great. I want to ask you if you could throw any light on the two of them in terms of ideology, other than peace versus conflict. I put aside the book to read when I completely concentrate. I haven't read it yet, but you talked about the journalists who he was seeing, and I've written about Charlie Bloomberg, whom I knew had talked about Mandela to me, and Mandela talked about Charlie Bloomberg to me as well. And the other was Reggie Cochrane. Those are the two journalists I know he was seeing. And both journalists working in the same building, didn't like each other ideologically or personally. And Charles was from the Congress movement, and Benji was sort of ultra pro-West. I mean, one of the reasons we're in trouble now is not about race or peace, it's about economics and economic ideology and the failure to develop that. So I just wonder if you could throw any light on how he, or even she, were thinking about ideology beyond peace and war.
So I don't think WINNIE gave any systematic thought to the future at all. I don't think she gave any programmatic thought to what would follow apartheid. I mean, she was very much a populist political figure who believed in putting emotion at the front. And that is how she spoke explicitly. You know, she said, you know, it became this myth, this metaphor, this relationship between her and her torturer. You know, where she said, we mutually hated one another and one of us had to die. One of us had to be extinguished. I mean, that was the register in which she spoke, the register of immediacy, of explosion, of now. I mean, writing this book, I sort of looked at the various fragments of what she'd say about the future, and there was never there was very, very little there. I mean, I remember reading an interview that she gave with Mandela's authorized biographer in 1996, so that was 2 years into democracy. And she came into the room very angry and upset in a big huff, and she said, my ex-husband is destroying this country. He's sold out to Western human rights groups. He's not doing things right. And the interviewer said, well, you know, what is it that he's sold out? And she said that this country is too violent and we need capital punishment in this country. And he's just trying to ingratiate himself to human rights movements abroad, and we need to bring back execution in this country. So quite interesting that that's what she thought was wrong. Sort of a real populist authoritarian stamping of authority. You know, on matters of distribution, of how the economy should be run, she said very little. I don't think that's where her energy was at. With Mandela, I mean, again, on economic questions, he had very little to say. He had a lot to say on political questions. So he desperately wanted a peaceful transition, but not at any cost. And for him, the bottom line was that it had to be a majoritarian democracy, that the various forms of federation and consociation and minority vetoes that the National Party wanted had to be off the table. It had to be proportional representation, and the party that, you know, that wins 50+1 governs. For him, the new order would not be legitimate unless it was a majoritarian democracy. So a very political conception of the future, but a very fuzzy economic conception of the future. So a strange thing about this, you know, this monumental battle between these two people over quite fundamental questions, you know, over how apartheid should end. The question of the economic order that would follow it barely figured in this big struggle between them. That's not where the energy of either of them was, really. Not much. I mean, he was seeing so many people by then. Oh, sorry, in the 50s, not in the 80s. No, I didn't get much of a sense of his relationship with the two of them. Don't have much to say about that. Yes.
You know, we live in a very violent country, and the book asks us to look at the marriage through their different ideas of violence. When growing up, we were definitely encouraged to see them both as, you know, as forms of potential violence at the very least. So it's, in a sense, it's you know, it's not a surprise that violence plays such an important role in our way that we understand it. It's also, I say, not a surprise that you see it that way, because obviously you've written books that deal with the problem of violence in South Africa. So I want to know how, in what way, if at all, did working on this book change the way you thought about the problem of violence in South Africa? Did you learn things that you didn't know before that made you rethink the way we should think about our history of violence and whether we have a future of violence?
Yeah, I did learn things that I didn't know before. Things that I didn't know. I didn't know. I didn't appreciate nearly enough quite how absolutely devastating the violence of the 1980s was, and quite how destructive it was. And that isn't to do with the sheer quotient, the quantitative amount of violence, which was obviously huge. It was the nature of the violence. And really the gap between the way the violence was described by the liberation movement and what was actually happening. You know, the liberation movement described it as a war between two sides. And what was actually happening in townships across the country is that violence had shattered and splintered in all directions, and neighbors were killing one another, and generations were killing one another. And I think that I hadn't yet appreciated that when, in situations of civil war, in situations where all authority is broken down, violence becomes a usable tool everywhere, in every conceivable relationship, in a community, in a family, in a society, and it can be used for limitless purposes. And that is what was happening in the 1980s. And looking so intensely at one household, at Winnie Mandela's household, and the extent to which it was happening in that household, the extent to which she paradoxically was a leader and an orchestrator of violence, but was really drowning in the limitlessness of that violence, was really seeing that full on. And was really painful looking at the 1980s again, and looking at not just the amount of destruction, the amount of blood, but just how people's sense of their world fell apart and meaning fell apart. And the thought of how long it takes to reconstitute a world after that. So in that sense, I was very much respectful of Nelson Mandela's intuitions and his wisdom, and his sense that if a country gets that deep into violence, it's very difficult to come out, that the damage that it does is horrific. And in many ways, I think that we're still paying the price for that today.
Hi, Jonny.
Hi.
Over here. Hi. Yes, I bought your book after reading The Number last year, which was a fantastic book. And I picked up, that you explore the theme and the power of myth, that it has in individuals' lives to completely transform our lives, change our beliefs, and give us the power to forge into a new direction. I think it strikes me that good politicians are also people that really understand the power that myth holds. I think Nelson Mandela understood it, in the emphasis that he put, for instance, on the Rugby World Cup and the power that had to transform the nation. And you could argue that politicians that we see emerging in today's time, like Trump, also understand the power of myth to shape, parallel realities. Do you think when it comes to politics that we are always resigned to some myth or the other, or do we have the option where, we could really lean on reason, and especially as we look to the current government that we have, where we really want people to be pragmatic and to work towards common purpose? Is that just a pipe dream? Is that just a myth? Or
well, I don't think that one should contrast myth and reason. I think that collective life is about developing myths. That's how we need to think of ourselves. I don't mean myth as fiction. I mean myth as something that is exemplary, something that teaches a lesson, something that is representative, bigger than itself. Politics deals in the currency of myth. It has no alternative. And those who know how to spin myths are those who are successful in politics. I think that's universal. The thing about Nelson Mandela is that he was a genius myth maker and an incredibly flexible myth maker. He could remake myths all the time. But an enormously pragmatic man, an enormously reasonable man, and would tailor myths, in a sense, too pragmatically, depending on what the moment required. So if you look at the course of his life, he played the violent guerrilla leader, he played the Christ-like martyr, and in the 1990s, he played the conciliator. the beaming, conciliatory, benign old man preaching peace, when inside he was a deeply, deeply angry man. He wore that mask in the 90s because he thought that was what was necessary. Very myth-like, but very, very pragmatic. Can we take this be the last one? I think we wouldn't want to keep people over time. He read many, many books in prison. He read very eclectically and not very systematically. But if there's an overarching theme, what he was most interested in was biographies of powerful white men, because in his mind, he knew that he was going to be talking to them one day. He knew he was going to be negotiating. And in the most positive sides of his imagination, when he wasn't brooding over his wife and family, he was imagining himself as a leader at a negotiating table. And so he read every biography of every white South African leader he could lay his hands on, but also John F. Kennedy he was fascinated with, was also a man who really dealt in myth. So those political biographies of powerful white men were important to him. And South African history was massively important to him. His deep fear of violence in part came from his reading around the South African War and the concentration camps at the turn of the century. He understood that his enemy had not recovered from that war decades later, and knew that his country would not recover from a similar war. So his reading was massively important to him in all sorts of ways. But let us end it here because we're at 6 o'clock, and see some of you upstairs. Thank you very much. Thank you.